Hello and welcome to the Whispering Worlds channel. Step into the emotional labyrinth of the price of betrayal and make it your own. This is more than a story of heartbreak and resilience. It's an invitation for you to explore the choices, challenges, and triumphs of Michael and Emily as they rebuild their lives from the ashes of their shared past. Your perspective matters. Share your thoughts, questions, or insights as we unravel their journey together. Narrator: the husband. I suppose every story of betrayal begins with a small, nagging doubt, the kind you push aside because it feels disloyal to the person you love. For me, it began with late-night meetings, a phone that seemed to buzz too often, and a distance growing between Emily and me. But I told myself she was ambitious, determined. She had always been driven by her career, and I admired that about her. We didn't have children to divide her attention, and her job seemed to fulfill a part of her that I couldn't. I accepted it, until the phone call. It was a Tuesday evening when one of her colleagues, Andrew, reached out. We weren't close friends, barely acquaintances from the occasional work party, so his name flashing on my screen immediately set off alarms. "Hey, Michael," he said, his voice tight with hesitation. "Look, this is awkward, and it's really none of my business, but I think you should know what's been happening." My pulse quickened. "What are you talking about?" There was a pause, a hesitation heavy with the weight of his next words. "Emily and Robert. It's not just work between them. A lot of us at the office have noticed. I thought you should hear it from someone who cares. Robert, her boss." The rest of the conversation blurred. My grip on the phone tightened as Andrew explained the whispered conversations, the suspicious glances, the time spent behind closed doors. I thanked him and hung up, feeling a cold dread settle in my chest. That night I didn't confront her. Instead, I observed. The late nights, the guarded expressions, the way she flinched when her phone vibrated. All the pieces began to fit together. Denial clawed at me, but deep down, I already knew the truth. A week later, I found myself in the office of a divorce attorney. The decision wasn't easy, but neither was it complicated. I loved Emily, or at least I loved the person I thought she was. But the thought of unraveling the web of lies, of dragging myself through the details of her betrayal, was unbearable. I didn't need closure, I needed distance. Emily didn't fight me on the divorce. She cried when I told her I knew, but her tears felt hollow. She didn't deny it. She didn't even try to explain. Perhaps she knew it wouldn't matter. Starting over was both terrifying and liberating. I moved out of the house we had shared, finding solace in a small, rented apartment on the other side of town. I threw myself into work, not because I loved it, but because it kept my mind occupied. And slowly, the idea of starting my own business began to take shape. The idea had been simmering in the back of my mind for years, but Emily's betrayal ignited something in me. I needed to build something of my own, to prove to myself that I could thrive without her. I drained my savings, took out a loan, and poured everything into a small tech startup. The long hours and sleepless nights didn't bother me. They were a welcome distraction. Emily, on the other hand, seemed to implode. Rumors of our divorce spread through her office, and with them, whispers of her affair. Her colleagues' respect for her waned, and Robert, the man she had risked everything for, distanced himself. I heard through mutual friends that she stayed in the company, clinging to the position she had worked so hard to achieve, but the loneliness weighed on her. Her vibrant, confident demeanor faded, replaced by a shadow of the woman I once knew. Despite everything, I didn't hate her, couldn't, but I no longer loved her either. She had made her choices and I had made mine. The first big breakthrough for my startup came on a rainy Friday evening, 2 years after the divorce. I stood in the modest office I had leased, staring at a whiteboard filled with ideas and plans. My phone buzzed on the desk, and I picked it up to find a text from an old friend. "Congrats on the new contract. Drinks on you next week." I smiled, setting the phone down. The deal had taken months to negotiate, but it was worth it. It was the first step toward a future I had built with my own hands. As I stood there, listening to the rain patter against the windows, I realized something. For the first time in years, I felt at peace. The pain of betrayal, the anger and sadness, They were still there, but they no longer defined me. I had found my own way forward, and that was enough. Narrator, Emily. When you've built your life around an illusion, the moment it shatters is both devastating and surreal. I used to think I had it all. A promising career, a loving husband, a bright future. Now, sitting in the cold, sterile light of my office at 9 p.m., I felt the crushing weight of what I had lost. It wasn't supposed to end this way. When I started my affair with Robert, it felt like a door opening to something exhilarating and new. He was charming, powerful, and attentive in ways that Michael hadn't been in years. I convinced myself it wasn't wrong. It was just a connection I needed. But those lies I told myself couldn't hold up under the harsh glare of reality. The day Michael confronted me, I broke. His quiet, measured tone as he explained he had filed for divorce cut deeper than any shout or accusation. I wanted to explain, to beg for forgiveness, but the words wouldn't come. He looked at me as if I were a stranger, and in that moment, I realized I had become one. The fallout at work was just as brutal. Rumors spread like wildfire. Whispers followed me through the halls, and colleagues who once respected me now avoided eye contact. Robert, the man I thought cared for me, became distant. He started delegating our projects to others and spending less time in the office. It was clear he wanted to sever ties without drawing more attention. One afternoon, I overheard two junior employees talking outside my office. "Did you hear about Emily? She used to be Robert's golden girl, but now she's just, well, you know." The word stung, but the worst part was knowing they were right. The nights were the hardest. Alone in my apartment, I replayed the choices that led me here, wishing I could undo them. My once bright future had dimmed, and the isolation was suffocating. I wanted to reach out to Michael, to apologize, but I knew it wouldn't change anything. He had moved on, building a new life without me. Robert's absence left a gaping hole in my career. Without his support, the projects I had championed faltered. Clients questioned my decisions, and my team's confidence in me eroded. Every misstep felt like another nail in the coffin of my professional reputation. One evening, after another grueling day, I received a message from Sarah, a former coworker and one of the few friends who hadn't abandoned me. "Let's grab dinner soon. I miss you," it read. It was a small gesture, but it felt like a lifeline. Maybe, just maybe, there was a way to start over, to rebuild. I didn't reply immediately. Instead, I stared at the message, tears streaming down my face. The path ahead felt impossible, but it was the only one left. For the first time in months, I allowed myself to hope, even if only for a moment. Narrator, Michael. When I started my own business, I didn't realize how much of myself I'd poured into the effort until the milestones started stacking up. In those first few months, it had been a survival tactic, a way to push forward while leaving the pain behind. But now, with the deal signed and the ink dry, there was nothing left to distract me. I sat in the quiet of my office late one evening, the buzz of the city beyond the windows like a distant hum. The space felt larger than it had any right to, with its secondhand furniture and walls bare except for the motivational posters that had come with the lease. "Success is the best revenge," read one, but I wasn't sure I believed it. I kept my circle small after the divorce. My friends were supportive but cautious, unsure of what to say or how to act. Even my best friend, Caleb, tread lightly, like stepping on the wrong conversational stone, might send me crumbling into the past. "So, what's next?" Caleb asked over beers one Friday night. His tone was casual, but the curiosity was genuine. "You've landed the big fish. Feels like you're winning at life." I chuckled, swirling my drink. "Winning's a stretch. Surviving, maybe." "You've done more than survive, man. Come on. The startup's thriving, you're healthier than ever. What's stopping you from saying you've moved on?" The truth was, I didn't know. It wasn't as if I wanted Emily back. That ship had sailed, its wreckage scattered across the ocean floor. But something lingered, a bitterness that tainted every small success, every fleeting moment of pride. Maybe it was the way things ended, or maybe it was knowing how much of myself I'd lost in the process. "I guess it's just complicated," I said finally, raising my glass in a mock toast. To surviving. To thriving, Caleb corrected, clinking his glass against mine. The deal I'd signed was the catalyst for growth, and with growth came decisions. I hired my first employee, a young woman named Laura who had just finished her MBA and spoke with the kind of energy I'd lost years ago. Her optimism was infectious, and her ability to navigate spreadsheets was unparalleled. "Michael," she said one afternoon, dropping a thick binder onto my desk, "we need to talk strategy. This deal is great, but without a plan, it's a sugar rush. Short-lived and exhausting." I smirked. "You're not wrong. Let's hear it." She outlined a vision that was as ambitious as it was logical, and for the first time in a long while, I felt a flicker of excitement. Maybe Caleb was right. Maybe I was thriving after all. One evening, as I worked late, again, a knock on my office door startled me. It was Laura holding 2 cups of coffee. "Thought you could use a pick-me-up," she said, handing me one. "You've been burning the midnight oil more than usual." "Thanks," I said, taking a grateful sip. "It's just habit at this point. Work used to be the only thing that kept me sane." "Used to be?" she asked, tilting her head. I hesitated, then shrugged. "It's different now. I'm starting to see the future as more than just a series of distractions. It's clearer." Her smile was warm, understanding. "That's good. Clarity's a rare thing these days." As I walked home that night, the city felt alive in a way I hadn't noticed before. The streetlights glowed, casting long shadows on the pavement, and the air was crisp with the promise of fall. I realized I was finally letting go of Emily, of the pain, of the bitterness that had kept me tethered to the past. The ruins of my old life were still there, but I was building something new on top of them. And for the first time, I believed it might just stand. Narrator, Emily. Loneliness wasn't something I had ever really understood before. Even in my busiest moments, surrounded by colleagues, friends, and Michael, I had taken the presence of others for granted. Now, I felt its sharp edges pressing in from all sides, an oppressive silence filling every corner of my apartment. The days at work were no better. The sideways glances, the hushed conversations just loud enough for me to hear, those cut deeper than any outright confrontation. I had once been respected, admired even. Now, I was the office pariah, the whispered cautionary tale of ambition gone too far. One afternoon, during what had become my routine of working through lunch at my desk, Sarah, my only remaining friend, appeared at the door of my office. "Got a minute?" she asked, her tone soft but direct. "Sure," I replied, gesturing for her to sit. I didn't look up from the stack of reports in front of me, but I could feel her gaze. "You need to stop hiding, Em." That made me look up. "I'm not hiding. I'm working." Sarah tilted her head, unimpressed. "Working through lunch, staying late, avoiding the break room. It's not fooling anyone. Least of all yourself." I opened my mouth to argue, but the words died in my throat. She wasn't wrong. I had buried myself in work, hoping to drown out the guilt, the shame, and the aching void Michael had left behind. But it wasn't working. "What else am I supposed to do?" I finally asked, my voice barely above a whisper. "You start by forgiving yourself," she said simply. "Then you figure out what you want your life to look like and work toward that. Not this." She gestured vaguely to the piles of paperwork surrounding me. That evening, I found myself staring into the mirror in my bathroom. My reflection was unfamiliar. The vibrant, confident woman I used to be had been replaced by someone I barely recognized. Tired eyes, a tense jaw, and an air of sadness that clung to me like a second skin. Sarah's words echoed in my mind. "You start by forgiving yourself." But how? How could I forgive the choices that had led me here, the people I had hurt along the way? A week later, Sarah dragged me out to a small art gallery opening. I resisted at first, claiming I had too much work, but she wouldn't take no for an answer. "You need this," she said, practically shoving me out the door. The gallery was small but lively, filled with the kind of people who spoke about art with a depth of passion I could never fake. I wandered aimlessly, stopping in front of a large abstract painting dominated by harsh red and black strokes. It was chaotic, violent even, but there was a strange beauty to it. "You like it?" a voice asked beside me. I turned to see a man in his late 30s, his hands tucked into the pockets of a tailored coat. He had an easy smile and a calm demeanor that put me at ease despite myself. "It's unsettling," I admitted. "But I think that's the point." He nodded, his gaze thoughtful. "Art doesn't always have to be pretty to be meaningful." We fell into an easy conversation, discussing the other pieces in the gallery and eventually branching into topics far removed from art. His name was Adam, a writer who had moved to the city a few years ago. He was easy to talk to, and for the first time in months, I felt a glimmer of something I thought I'd lost: connection. That night, as I walked back to my apartment, I realized something had shifted. It wasn't a grand epiphany or a sudden surge of optimism. It was small, barely noticeable, but it was there. A tiny spark of hope that maybe, just maybe, I could start over. Narrator Michael. Life, I had learned, has a way of surprising you when you least expect it. 2 years after the divorce, I found myself standing at a crossroads I hadn't anticipated. My business was thriving, my social circle had expanded, and I'd even started dating again. Tentatively, cautiously, as though testing the waters for the first time. Yet, despite all the progress, something lingered, a quiet tug at the back of my mind that refused to be ignored. It was a crisp Saturday morning when I decided to visit the old park near our former home. I hadn't been back since I moved out, but something about the changing leaves and the distant memory of simpler times pulled me there. The park had always been Emily's favorite spot, a place she dragged me to on countless weekends, insisting we walk its winding paths and sit by the pond to watch the ducks. The familiarity was jarring. The bench we used to sit on still faced the pond, its paint chipped but otherwise unchanged. I sat down, the cold wood biting through my jacket, and let the memories wash over me. It was here I realized that we had once talked about our dreams, our future, plans that now felt like they belonged to another life. "Michael!" The voice startled me, its familiarity sending a jolt through my chest. I turned to see Emily standing a few feet away, her hands tucked into the pockets of a gray coat. She looked different, older, perhaps, or maybe just wearier, but her eyes held the same intensity that had once drawn me to her. "Emily," I said, my tone more neutral than I felt. "What are you doing here?" "I could ask you the same," she replied, a faint smile tugging at her lips. "This used to be our spot, our spot." The words hung in the air, heavy with implications neither of us dared to voice. She hesitated before sitting down beside me, leaving a polite distance between us. For a moment, neither of us spoke, the silence filled only by the distant quacking of ducks and the rustling of leaves. "You look well," she said finally, her voice soft. "Thanks. You too," I replied automatically, though the words felt hollow. She didn't look well, not really. There was a fragility about her now, a sense of someone who had been through a storm and was still trying to find her footing. "I've been meaning to reach out," she said, her gaze fixed on the pond. "But I didn't think you'd want to hear from me." I didn't answer right away. The truth was, I wasn't sure how I felt. Seeing her again stirred emotions I thought I'd buried: anger, sadness, and a faint, unwelcome pang of longing. "Why now?" I asked finally. She sighed, her breath visible in the chilly air. "Because I owe you an apology. A real one. Not just for what I did, but for the way I left things. You didn't deserve that." I studied her, searching for any hint of insincerity, but her expression was earnest. Vulnerable even. "Emily," I said carefully, "I've moved on. I've built a life for myself, a good one, and I'm not sure reopening old wounds is a good idea." "I understand," she said quickly, her voice tinged with sadness. "I'm not asking for anything. I needed to say it. For my own sake, if nothing else." We sat in silence after that, the weight of her words settling between us. Part of me wanted to tell her it was okay, that I'd forgiven her long ago, but another part of me, the part that remembered the pain of those nights alone, wasn't ready to let go completely. "I hope you find what you're looking for," I said finally, standing up. She looked up at me, her eyes glistening, and nodded. "Thank you," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. As I walked away, the sound of leaves crunching beneath my feet, I realized I felt lighter somehow. Maybe it was the closure I hadn't known I needed, or maybe it was simply the act of facing the past and letting it go. Either way, for the first time in years, I felt truly free. Narrator, Emily. Seeing Michael again was like stepping into a dream I couldn't quite shake, a blend of nostalgia and regret that left me reeling. As I watched him walk away, his figure growing smaller against the backdrop of the park, I felt the familiar ache of loss settle deep in my chest. This time, though, it wasn't just about what I had lost, it was about what he had gained. He looked good, better than I had seen him in years. There was a confidence in his stride, an ease in his demeanor that hadn't been there when we were together. I wondered if I had ever truly seen him for who he was, or if my ambition had blinded me to the man he had always been. The walk back to my apartment felt longer than usual, the city's usual bustle muted against the hum of my thoughts. I replayed our conversation over and over, dissecting every word, every glance. I had wanted closure, but instead, I found myself questioning everything. That night, I sat by the window with a glass of wine, staring out at the city lights. They twinkled in the distance, a reminder of the world that had moved on, while I remained stuck in the same loop of regret and self-recrimination. My phone buzzed on the table, and I glanced at it to see a message from Sarah. "Sarah, how are you holding up? Did you go to the park?" I smiled faintly, grateful for her persistence. Typing a quick reply, I tried to convey the swirling mess of emotions I couldn't quite articulate. I saw him. It was hard, but I think I needed it. Her response came almost immediately. "Sarah, that's progress, Em. One step at a time." The next day, I found myself sorting through old photographs, something I had avoided since the divorce. Most were from the early years of my marriage, moments frozen in time when everything felt simpler. There was one of Michael and me at the park, sitting on that same bench by the pond. I was laughing, my head tilted back, and he was looking at me with an expression I now recognized as love. It struck me how easily I had let that love slip away, trading it for fleeting validation and a misguided sense of fulfillment. Robert, his charm, his attention, had been a distraction, not the answer I thought he was. The realization hit me with a clarity that was both freeing and painful. I had been searching for something external to fill a void that only I could address. Determined to make a change, I decided to take a step Sarah had been urging me toward for months. That evening, I signed up for a support group for women navigating divorce and rebuilding their lives. The idea of sharing my story with strangers terrified me, but I knew it was time to confront the parts of myself I had been avoiding. The first meeting was held in a small community center, the kind of place that smelled faintly of coffee and cleaning supplies. The room was filled with women of all ages, each carrying their own stories of heartache and resilience. When it was my turn to speak, my hands trembled, but I forced myself to be honest. "My name is Emily," I began, my voice wavering, "and I made mistakes that cost me everything. I thought I could rebuild my life by ignoring the past, but I'm realizing now that the only way forward is to face it." The group listened without judgment, their nods and gentle encouragement giving me the courage to keep going. For the first time in a long time, I felt seen, not as the sum of my failures but as a person capable of change. Walking home that night, I felt a strange sense of peace. It wasn't the kind of resolution that came from fixing everything, but the quiet understanding that I didn't have to fix it all at once. Life was messy, complicated, and often painful, but it was also full of second chances, if I was willing to take them. I glanced up at the sky, the stars barely visible against the city's glow, and smiled. I didn't know what the future held, but for the first time in years, I was ready to find out. Narrator Michael. By the time fall deepened into winter, my life had settled into a steady rhythm. The startup was thriving, my team had grown, and for the first time I felt like I had a solid foundation under my feet. But even with all the progress, I couldn't ignore the memory of that afternoon in the park. Seeing Emily had been a jolt to the system, a reminder of how much had changed and how far I'd come. It had also stirred questions I wasn't sure I wanted to answer. Was I truly at peace with the past? Or had I just buried it under layers of distraction? Caleb, ever the voice of reason or chaos, depending on the day, dragged me out for drinks one evening. The bar was cozy, its dark wood and warm lighting a stark contrast to the icy streets outside. We found a corner booth, and Caleb wasted no time getting to the heart of the matter. "You've been weird since the park thing," he said, sipping his beer. "What's going on in that overthinking brain of yours?" "I'm fine," I said automatically. At his raised eyebrow, I sighed and admitted, "It just brought up a lot. Closure, I guess." "Closure's good. Healthy even," he said, leaning back. "But don't let it mess with what you've got now. You're in a good place, man. Don't forget that." "I know," I said, and I meant it. Still, the conversation lingered in my mind long after we left the bar. One snowy morning, as I worked from my home office, an email pinged into my inbox. It was from Laura, my most dedicated employee, with the subject line, "Community Outreach Proposal." Curious, I opened it and found a detailed plan for partnering with local charities to provide tech training to underserved communities. "This is ambitious," I muttered to myself, but I couldn't deny the spark of excitement it ignited. I called Laura into my office later that day. She walked in with her usual energy, her eyes bright with anticipation. "This is impressive," I said, holding up the proposal. "What inspired it?" She shrugged, a hint of a smile on her lips. "I just think we're at a point where we can give back. It's not just about profit. It's about purpose." Her words resonated more than I expected. Purpose. That was something I hadn't thought much about in the chaos of rebuilding my life. But now, as I looked at the proposal, I realized it was exactly what I needed. The first workshop we organized was held in a small community center, the kind of place that buzzed with quiet determination. Watching the participants, young adults eager to learn, older folks curious but cautious, I felt a sense of fulfillment I hadn't experienced in years. It wasn't just about building a business anymore. It was about building something meaningful. After the workshop, Laura and I stayed behind to clean up. As we stacked chairs and gathered supplies, she turned to me and said, "This was a good day, wasn't it?" "It was," I agreed, smiling. "A really good day." That night, as I walked home through the snow-dusted streets, I felt a sense of peace settle over me. Life wasn't perfect, and it never would be. But it was good and it was mine. For the first time, I wasn't just surviving, I was living. Narrator, Emily. Winter always had a way of slowing everything down, forcing moments of reflection I usually tried to avoid. The city was quieter under its blanket of snow, and as the year wound down, so did the chaos I had grown accustomed to. My evenings were no longer filled with frantic work or restless nights. Instead, I found myself alone with my thoughts, and for once I didn't try to drown them out. The support group had become a lifeline, a place where I could be honest without fear of judgment. Each session left me lighter, as though sharing my story chipped away at the walls I had built around myself. It was in one of these meetings, surrounded by women whose resilience inspired me, that I realized I wanted more for my life. I didn't want to just survive. I wanted to thrive. It started small, as most things do. I reached out to Sarah, inviting her over for dinner. She arrived with a bottle of wine and her usual warmth, filling my apartment with laughter and conversation that had been missing for far too long. "You're starting to sound like your old self again," she said, raising her glass in a toast. "Here's to second chances." "To second chances," I echoed, clinking my glass against hers. One evening, after a particularly cathartic support group session, I stayed behind to chat with the facilitator, an older woman named Margaret whose wisdom was as calming as her presence. "Do you ever feel like it's too late?" I asked, voicing the question that had been gnawing at me. Margaret smiled gently. "It's never too late, Emily. The only thing that matters is what you do with the time you have now." Her words lingered with me, planting a seed I couldn't ignore. I started thinking about what I wanted my future to look like, not just in vague terms, but in tangible steps. And for the first time in years, I allowed myself to dream. A week later, I found myself sitting at my kitchen table, laptop open, as I drafted an application for a leadership program I had always admired but never dared to pursue. It was a long shot, but the process of writing about my goals and experiences reminded me of the person I used to be, the person I wanted to become again. The next step was even harder, apologizing to people I had hurt. I started with a letter to a former colleague, someone I had stepped on during my climb to the top. Writing it was painful, but when she replied with unexpected forgiveness, I felt a weight lift off my shoulders. Not everything was smooth sailing. At work, the whispers hadn't entirely disappeared, and rebuilding trust with my team was a slow, humbling process. But I approached each day with a renewed sense of purpose, determined to prove that I was more than my mistakes. One afternoon, Sarah texted me with a link to an article about a community tech workshop. "Thought you might like this," her message read. Curious, I clicked the link and found myself reading about Michael's company. The workshop was part of a new outreach program he had started, and the article praised his efforts to make a difference. Seeing his name brought a rush of emotions, but this time, there was no bitterness, only admiration. "You should reach out," Sarah suggested when I mentioned it over coffee. "No," I said quickly. "He's moved on. It's better this way." But the idea lingered, a quiet whisper in the back of my mind. That evening, as I stared at my laptop screen, I hesitated before typing out a simple email. Subject: "Thank you. Hi Michael. I saw the article about your workshop and just wanted to say congratulations. What you're doing is incredible, and I'm truly happy for you. Take care, Emily." I hit send before I could overthink it, my heart pounding in the silence that followed. It wasn't an attempt to rekindle anything. It was just a step forward, a small gesture of respect for the man I had once loved and the person I was becoming. As I closed the laptop, I felt something I hadn't felt in years. Hope, not for a specific outcome, but for the simple act of trying, of reaching out, of believing that second chances were worth pursuing. Narrator Michael. The email from Emily arrived on a quiet evening, just as I was wrapping up my work for the day. The subject line, simple and unassuming, caught my attention immediately. I hesitated before opening it, my mind racing through possibilities. We hadn't spoken since that day in the park, and I wasn't sure what to expect. When I finally read the message, I felt an unexpected warmth in her words. It wasn't overly sentimental or apologetic, just a genuine acknowledgement of what I had built and a simple wish for my success. For a moment, I sat back in my chair, staring at the screen, unsure of how to respond. Caleb, of course, had plenty to say when I mentioned it to him over dinner later that week. "She's reaching out," he said, his tone deliberate. "You think she wants something?" "I don't think so," I replied. "It didn't feel that way. It was nice, actually." "Nice?" he echoed, raising an eyebrow. "Man, you've got to stop overthinking. If it felt nice, then maybe it was just that. A nice gesture. Maybe he was right." Emily's message didn't demand anything, and for once, I didn't feel the weight of old wounds. Felt like a small step forward, even if I wasn't sure what it meant. I drafted my response the next day, keeping it short but sincere. Subject: Thank you. Hi Emily. Thank you for your kind words. It means a lot coming from you. I hope you're doing well, and I wish you the best in everything you're pursuing. Take care, Michael. I hit send and immediately felt a strange mix of relief and unease. It wasn't about reopening old doors. I had no intention of revisiting what we'd had. But acknowledging her felt like a small act of closure, a way of affirming that we had both moved on. Weeks passed, and life continued its steady march forward. The outreach program expanded, bringing new energy to the company and drawing attention from local media. It was rewarding work, the kind that reminded me why I had started this journey in the first place. One afternoon, as I wrapped up a meeting, Laura knocked on my office door. She stepped in with a hesitant smile, holding a folded newspaper. "You might want to see this," she said, placing it on my desk. The article was about a leadership program, one that had recently accepted Emily as a participant. It described her as a rising star in her field, someone who had faced challenges and emerged stronger. There was a photo of her, smiling confidently, and a quote about the importance of resilience and second chances. "She's doing well," Laura said after a moment, her tone carefully neutral. "Yeah," I replied, setting the paper down. "It looks like she is." That evening, as I walked home through the busy streets, I couldn't help but think about how much had changed. We were no longer the people we had been when we were together. Time had transformed us, reshaped our lives in ways we couldn't have predicted. For the first time, I allowed myself to feel a quiet sense of pride for Emily. It wasn't about rekindling anything or dwelling on the past. It was simply the acknowledgement of someone who had once been a significant part of my life and was now finding her own path. The thought brought a sense of peace I hadn't expected. Life was full of bridges, some we crossed, others we left behind. And sometimes the act of building them was enough. Narrator, Emily. Spring arrived slowly, creeping into the city with soft breezes and budding flowers. For the first time in years, I felt like I was growing with it. The leadership program had been transformative, pushing me to confront parts of myself I had long ignored. I wasn't just rebuilding my career, I was reshaping my identity. One afternoon, while working on a community project as part of the program, I received an unexpected email. The sender was Michael. Subject: Your program. "Hi Emily, I saw the article about your leadership program. Congratulations, it looks like you're doing amazing things. Wishing you continued success. Take care, Michael." Reading his words, I felt a wave of emotions. Gratitude, nostalgia, and a quiet pride. His acknowledgement meant more than I had anticipated, not because I needed his validation, but because it felt like a final bridge between who we were and who we had become. The leadership program culminated in a public presentation, where each participant shared their journey and their vision for the future. Standing on that stage, facing a room full of strangers, I spoke honestly about my mistakes and the lessons they had taught me. "My journey hasn't been easy," I said, my voice steady. "But I've learned that growth comes from facing the hardest truths about ourselves. It's never too late to change, to rebuild, and to create a life filled with purpose." The applause was warm, but it was the sense of release that stayed with me. For the first time, I felt truly free from the shadow of my past. Michael attended the event. I hadn't expected him to, but there he was, sitting quietly in the back row. When it was over, he approached me, his expression kind and open. "You were incredible," he said simply. "Thank you," I replied, smiling. "I'm glad you came." We walked together to the lobby, the conversation flowing easily. Felt natural, like talking to an old friend. There was no tension, no unresolved anger. Just two people who had shared a history and were now walking their own paths. As we stood by the door, I turned to him. "Michael, I just want to say thank you. For everything. For helping me see what I couldn't before." He nodded, his smile genuine. "And thank you for showing me how much I could grow. I'm proud of us, Emily. Both of us." We said our goodbyes, and as I watched him leave, I felt a deep sense of peace. It wasn't about rekindling what we had lost. It was about recognizing the ways we had both changed and finding closure in that. That night, as I sat on my balcony, watching the city lights twinkle, I thought about the journey that had brought me here. Life was unpredictable, filled with pain and joy in equal measure. But it was also forgiving, offering second chances to those brave enough to take them. I wasn't sure what the future held, but for the first time, that uncertainty didn't scare me. It excited me, because I had learned that no matter how far you fall, there is always a way to rise again. Dear listeners, please share your thoughts in the comments section below, and don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to the channel.